Malik's face hit the bench as Officer Walker's knee pressed into his back. "Stop resisting!" Walker barked, though Malik wasn't moving. A woman screamed, filming everything. Then a black SUV screeched to a stop and a cold voice cut through the chaos. "FBI, step away from the suspect!" What happened next would shock everyone, especially Walker. But let's start from the beginning. It was a perfect afternoon, the kind where the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting soft golden light over the park's trimmed grass and clean pathways. The air was warm, and the faint sound of children laughing on the playground mixed with the distant chirping of birds. It was the kind of day where nothing bad was supposed to happen. 16-year-old Malik Johnson sat on a weathered wooden bench near the basketball court, his long legs stretched out and his back slouched comfortably against the bench's backrest. Sweat glistened on his dark brown skin, a reminder of the intense practice he'd just finished. His earbuds were in, music humming softly in his ears as he scrolled through his phone, trying to relax. His athletic build hinted at his time on the court, but his face was calm, relaxed, yet aware. Malik wasn't naive. He knew what could happen if you were a young black teenager sitting alone in a mostly white neighborhood. But this was his park, too. He had a right to be here. Malik barely noticed the tall figure walking toward him at first, the hard thud of boots on pavement, until a shadow stretched over his lap, cutting off the sun. He looked up and instantly felt his chest tighten. Officer Todd Walker stood over him like a storm cloud. Tall and broad-shouldered, Walker had the presence of someone used to being obeyed. His pale blue uniform was perfectly pressed, the glint of his badge catching the sunlight. A buzz cut framed his sharp, angular face, and his cold, calculating eyes narrowed as he stared down at Malik. His hand rested near the holster on his hip. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" Walker's voice was hard, that kind of sharp, clipped tone Malik had heard before. That tone meant trouble. Malik blinked, pulling out one of his earbuds. His stomach twisted. "Just sitting here. Why?" Walker's eyes darkened. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, stepping closer. "I got a call about suspicious activity in the park." Malik's brows furrowed. Suspicious activity? He glanced around. Families were sitting on blankets. A group of kids was running across the grass. No one else seemed to be getting questioned. "I didn't do anything." Walker's jaw tightened. His hand twitched toward his belt. "Stand up." Malik stayed seated, tension coiling in his chest. His pulse quickened. "For what?" "I said stand up." Malik's breath hitched, his feet planted into the ground. He knew better than to argue, but his body resisted the order. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't going to make a scene. Walker's expression darkened. He reached down and grabbed Malik's arm. Hard. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Malik's head jerked up. "What?" "You heard me," Walker growled, his grip tightening. Malik yanked his arm back instinctively. His heart hammered in his chest. "I didn't do anything." Walker's eyes flashed with anger. He yanked Malik's arm harder, pulling him halfway off the bench. Malik stumbled, his feet skidding across the concrete. "Hey, stop!" Malik shouted, panic rising in his throat. Walker shoved him toward the bench, twisting his arm behind his back. Pain flared up Malik's shoulder. "Stop resisting!" Walker barked. "I'm not resisting!" Malik shouted, his voice strained from the pressure on his arm. A few people nearby stopped walking. A young couple turned toward the commotion. A man jogging with his dog slowed down, his brows knitting together. "Hey!" A woman's voice cut through the tension. Malik caught a blur of a figure through his peripheral vision. A white woman in a business suit had her phone raised. Her face was tight with anger. "What the hell are you doing?" the woman demanded. "Stay out of it," Walker growled, his knee pressing harder into Malik's back. Malik's face scraped against the hard wood of the bench as Walker forced his arms behind him. His heart slammed against his ribcage. "He's a kid!" the woman shouted, stepping closer. Walker ignored her. He pulled the cuffs from his belt and clicked them over Malik's wrists with a brutal snap. Malik gasped as the cold metal bit into his skin. His breathing was ragged now. He was losing control. "Get off of him!" someone else shouted from across the park. A man in a polo shirt and khakis stepped forward. His face was red with anger. "What the hell are you arresting him for?" "Stay back!" Walker shouted, dragging Malik up by the back of his shirt. Malik's legs wobbled as Walker shoved him forward toward the patrol car. "You can't just arrest someone for sitting in a park," the woman screamed, her phone still recording. Walker's face twisted. His hand hovered near his gun. His breath was shallow. "Back off! Now!" Malik's knees nearly buckled as Walker forced him toward the car. His mind spun. What was happening? What was this even for? He couldn't breathe. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He couldn't give Walker that satisfaction. People were closing in now, the crowd growing. The tension in the air was thick and electric. People were yelling. Phones were out. Someone shouted, "This is bullshit!" But Walker didn't care. His hand was on his gun. His face was hard. His breath quick and shallow. Malik could feel the panic blooming in his chest like a fist, threatening to close around his lungs. Walker twisted Malik's arm again, forcing him to his knees. Malik gasped in pain, his mouth opening, but the sound didn't come out. "Stop resisting!" Walker shouted. "I'm not!" Malik cried, his voice breaking. "Let him go!" the woman screamed, stepping closer with her phone still recording. Walker's grip tightened. Malik's eyes squeezed shut as the crowd's shouting blended into a single roar of noise. His chest was heaving, his hands were trembling. Walker's knee pressed into his back, harder this time. Malik's face twisted in pain as his cheek pressed into the ground. And then, Malik's mind flashed to his mother. Her face, the way she smiled at him when he got home from school, the sound of her laugh. He couldn't let this be the end. His breath shuddered. His pulse hammered in his ears. The voices blurred together, yelling, screaming, chaos. Malik's body sagged under the weight of Walker's knee. His wrists were burning from the cuffs. His eyes squeezed shut. He couldn't fight back. He couldn't breathe. He didn't know how this was going to end. And then the world went quiet. "Stop resisting!" Walker barked, his voice sharp and cutting through the thick tension in the air. His face was twisted in barely contained rage, his eyes hard and narrow. "I'm not resisting!" Malik shouted, his breath hitching painfully in his chest. His arms burned from the tight metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists. His heart pounded violently against his rib cage as his face pressed against the rough wood of the park bench. His whole body was trembling, but he wasn't resisting. He knew better than to resist. Walker's knee ground harder into Malik's back, forcing his chest against the bench. The hard wood cut into his ribs, each breath coming out short and shallow. Panic flared in his chest as his arms strained behind him, pinned unnaturally at an angle that sent waves of pain through his shoulders. "Keep your mouth shut," Walker hissed, leaning in so close that Malik could feel the officer's hot breath against his ear. Malik's eyes squeezed shut as a fresh burst of fear coiled through his chest. His mind screamed at him to stay calm, to keep his body still. Any movement could be mistaken for resistance. And Walker was looking for an excuse. Malik knew that. A woman's voice broke through the noise of the park. "Someone help him!" Her voice was sharp and high-pitched, cutting through the growing chaos like a knife. Malik's eyes flicked toward the sound, and through the blur of fear and noise, he saw her. A woman in a gray business suit, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun, phone raised and recording. Her face was flushed with outrage. People were starting to gather. The casual chatter of the park had died away, replaced by the low buzz of tension. Footsteps slowed, conversations halted, heads turned. Malik could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on him now. A man in a business suit stepped forward, his tie loosened at the collar. He looked like he had just left work. His brow furrowed as he took in the scene. The teenager pinned to the bench, the cop pressing down on him. "He's a kid!" the man shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a slap. "What are you doing?" Walker's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto the man with a cold, calculating glare. "Back off," Walker growled, his voice low and dangerous. His hand twitched toward the gun on his hip. Malik's pulse skyrocketed. His body went cold despite the heat burning under his skin. His arms tensed instinctively as Walker's grip on his wrist tightened. The weight of Walker's knee pressed into his back so hard it felt like his spine might snap. "I didn't do anything," Malik shouted, his voice breaking under the strain. His breath was coming in sharp gasps now, and his throat burned from the effort. His muscles trembled beneath the pressure, his body instinctively fighting against the crushing force. Walker's lips curled into a thin, predatory smile. He stood and hauled Malik to his feet in one violent motion. Malik's legs wobbled beneath him, his knees buckled as Walker yanked him upward by the back of his hoodie. The collar dug into Malik's throat, cutting off his air for a second before his feet found the ground. Walker's grip on his arm was bruising, his fingers digging into the muscle as he shoved Malik forward toward the patrol car. Malik stumbled. His foot caught on the uneven pavement, and his body twisted as he nearly fell face first into the side of the car. "You can't arrest him for sitting in a park." Another voice now, a middle-aged woman standing near the swing set, her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and fury. Walker's jaw twitched. His eyes darkened. He turned toward the crowd, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his uniform. His hand hovered near his holster. "Mind your own business," Walker snapped, his voice cracking with irritation. His grip on Malik's arm tightened painfully as he wrenched open the car door with his free hand. Malik's chest heaved. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. The inside of the car loomed in front of him, dark, enclosed, suffocating. The rough black plastic of the back seat seemed to pulse in his vision, and the sharp metallic scent of the interior filled his nose. Malik's heart was hammering so hard that his head buzzed. His hands were numb. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Walker grabbed the back of Malik's hoodie and shoved him toward the open door. Malik's foot hit the side of the car, his body tilted dangerously forward, and then, "FBI, step away from the suspect." The words cut through the chaos like a gunshot. Walker's head jerked toward the voice. His grip on Malik's hoodie slackened for a fraction of a second. Malik's eyes widened. The crowd went still. Even the children on the playground had stopped running. A hush fell over the park as every head turned toward the source of the voice. Walker's back stiffened, his jaw clenching so tightly that the muscles along his neck visibly strained beneath the skin. His hand hovered near the gun on his hip. His breath came out sharp and fast. Malik's chest was heaving. His knees were weak beneath him. His hands, still cuffed behind his back, trembled uncontrollably. His vision blurred at the edges. His body was still processing the adrenaline flooding his veins. Walker's grip on Malik's arm tightened. Malik winced, his breath hitching. His eyes darted toward the crowd, searching for the voice, the source of the command. No one moved. No one breathed. Walker's gaze turned toward the path leading into the park. His eyes narrowed. His whole body was coiled with tension, a spring wound so tightly that it was about to snap. Malik's chest rose and fell with shaky breaths. His body sagged beneath the weight of the cuffs, beneath the memory of Walker's knee in his back, beneath the crushing awareness that this wasn't over yet. Walker's lips parted as if to speak, and then Malik's knees gave out. His body sagged toward the pavement as the sharp, metallic taste of fear filled his mouth. His chest was still burning. His pulse hammered violently in his ears. His mind screamed at him to stay calm, to stay upright. But his legs wouldn't listen. Walker's grip remained locked around his arm like a vice. His face twisted in frustration. His body was still angled toward the source of the voice, his hand hovering near his holster. The park was deathly quiet now. The tension in the air was sharp enough to cut skin. Malik's heart thudded painfully in his chest. His breath hitched. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His whole body was trembling. Walker's knuckles were white where his hand gripped Malik's arm. His chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow bursts. And then, a second voice. Calm, controlled, sharp as steel. I said, "Step away from the suspect." Walker's jaw clenched. Malik's breath hitched. His eyes widened. His legs barely held him upright. The sound of footsteps, slow, measured, heavy against the pavement. Walker's head snapped toward the sound. His hand slid toward his holster. Malik squeezed his eyes shut. His breath shuddered out of him. The weight of Walker's hand on his arm didn't lessen, and Malik knew this was far from over. Walker froze. His hand tightened on Malik's arm as the black SUV rolled up next to the patrol car, the low rumble of the engine cutting through the tense silence like a growl. The vehicle's tinted windows reflected the sharp sunlight, making it impossible to see who was inside. The rear door opened with a sharp click. A polished black shoe stepped onto the pavement first, followed by a tall figure in a dark suit. His posture was straight, controlled, dangerous. Agent David Miller emerged, his crisp white shirt perfectly tucked beneath his jacket. His sharp brown eyes swept the scene with predatory focus. His badge gleamed in his hand as he held it up. "Officer Walker, release the suspect, now." Walker's grip on Malik's arm didn't loosen. His jaw flexed beneath the rigid line of his face as his eyes darkened dangerously. His chest rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths. "This is police business," Walker said through clenched teeth. Miller stepped forward. His face remained blank, his expression coldly professional. He didn't blink. "Not anymore," Miller replied. His voice was calm, almost too calm. The kind of calm that suggested complete control. Walker's hand twitched toward his gun. Malik felt the movement like an electric shock running through his veins. His breath hitched in his throat. His whole body went rigid. He could feel Walker's tension vibrating through his arm, through the bruising grip on his wrist. "Don't even think about it." A new voice cut through the tension like a blade. Agent Sarah Quinn stepped out of the SUV, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She wore a fitted black suit and a look that could stop a freight train. Her gray eyes were steel beneath the sharp arch of her brows. She wasn't smiling. Her hand rested near the holster on her hip. Walker's head turned toward her. His hand hovered just above his holster, his face flushed red beneath the harsh light of the sun. "He's resisting arrest!" Walker shouted, his voice edged with desperation now. His grip on Malik's arm tightened so hard that Malik flinched. "I'm not!" Malik's voice broke from the pressure in his chest. His shoulders strained from the angle of his arms behind his back. His wrists burned where the metal of the cuffs cut into his skin. His breath hitched in sharp, ragged bursts. Miller's gaze sharpened. He took a single step closer. His presence shifted the balance of the entire scene. The tension in the air became sharp and brittle, ready to snap. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but his eyes were hard, predatory. "Let him go," Miller said softly. His voice was low, dangerous. "Or this is about to get a lot worse for you." Walker's lips curled. His grip on Malik's arm didn't loosen. His chest heaved beneath his uniform. The veins along the side of his neck bulged with tension. His eyes darted between Miller and Quinn, calculating, measuring. Walker was a man who was used to power. He was used to control, and now it was slipping through his fingers. His breath quickened. His hand trembled above his holster. Quinn's gray eyes narrowed. Her hand twitched toward her gun. The muscles in her jaw flexed as her gaze locked on Walker like a targeting system. "I'd think carefully about your next move, Officer Walker," she said. Her voice was devoid of emotion, and somehow that made it more threatening. Walker's breathing was loud now, ragged. His hand hovered over his gun for half a second too long. Miller's eyes darkened. His gaze sharpened. Walker's hand dropped from his holster, but his grip on Malik's arm stayed locked in place. His jaw worked beneath his skin as his eyes darted toward the gathering crowd. The phones, the faces. He was losing control of the situation. Miller took another step forward, closing the space between them. His gaze was sharp enough to cut glass. "Let him go." Walker's breathing hitched. His face burned beneath the sun. The sound of his pulse hammered through his ears. His hand twitched. His grip on Malik's arm squeezed once, hard, before he let go. Malik stumbled as the pressure vanished from his arm. His knees buckled slightly, and his body tilted forward. The blood rushed painfully back into his wrists as the sharp sting of the cuffs pressed harder into his skin. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. Quinn's eyes never left Walker as Miller stepped past them both. Miller's hands were steady as he reached down and unclipped the cuffs. The metal clicked open with a sharp snap. Malik's arms fell limply to his sides. His wrists were red and swollen where the cuffs had dug into his skin. He flexed his fingers, feeling the pins and needles rush through his hands as the circulation returned. Miller's hand brushed Malik's shoulder lightly. "Are you okay?" Malik swallowed hard. His chest was still tight, his breathing shallow. His throat burned from the effort of holding it together. His pulse throbbed painfully in his ears. "Yeah." His voice was barely a whisper. Miller's hand stayed on his shoulder for a second longer, steady, grounding. Walker's face was dark with rage. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands curled into fists at his sides. His chest heaved. His eyes burned into Miller's back like a threat. Quinn's gaze cut toward Walker. Her hand remained on her hip. Her expression was as sharp and cold as the edge of a knife. Miller stepped back, his hand still light on Malik's shoulder. Malik's legs felt weak beneath him. His hands were shaking at his sides, his fingers curling and uncurling as his body struggled to process the flood of adrenaline crashing through his system. Walker's mouth opened again. His chest rose and fell in quick bursts. His eyes narrowed into thin slits. Miller's gaze sharpened. Quinn's hand tightened over her holster. Walker's eyes darkened. His chest heaved. His lips curled back over his teeth. His gaze flicked toward Malik. Not just anger, but something uglier beneath it. Miller stepped slightly in front of Malik, his stance widening. Quinn's gaze stayed locked on Walker's face. Walker's hands curled into fists at his sides. And then, Walker took a step back. His jaw tightened so hard that the muscles twitched beneath his skin. His breath came in sharp bursts through his nose. He turned and stormed toward his patrol car. His boots hit the pavement hard. His hands flexed at his sides as he walked. He yanked open the door of the car and slammed it shut behind him so hard the windows rattled. Miller's gaze followed him the whole way. Quinn didn't move. Malik's breath shuddered. His chest was still heaving. His wrists throbbed. His knees were weak beneath him. He wiped the back of his hand over his mouth. His eyes squeezed shut for a second before opening again. Miller's hand was steady on his shoulder. Walker's car idled for a long moment before it rolled away down the street. The sound of the engine faded into the background noise of the park. Miller's hand squeezed Malik's shoulder gently before letting go. "You're okay now," Miller said quietly. Malik's breath steadied. He nodded once. but his chest was still tight. His wrists still throbbed. His whole body felt like it had just barely survived something that had almost gone very, very wrong. Miller's gaze stayed on Walker's retreating car for a long time. His mouth was set in a hard line. His eyes darkened beneath the sharp cut of his brow. This wasn't over. Walker stepped toward Miller, his jaw tight, his breath shallow and sharp. His eyes burned beneath the brim of his hat, thin slits of icy blue cutting through the heat of the afternoon. His hands flexed at his sides, controlled tension, but only barely. The veins along his forearms bulged beneath the crisp blue fabric of his uniform. His chest rose and fell with hard, deliberate breaths. He stopped close, too close, standing toe to toe with Miller. His chin lifted slightly, his eyes narrowing beneath the harsh angle of his brow. "You have no jurisdiction here," Walker said, lowering his voice to a low, dangerous growl. His tone was cold steel wrapped in thinly veiled rage. His lips barely moved as he spoke, and his gaze never wavered from Miller's face. Miller didn't move. His posture remained perfectly straight, calm. His hands were still loose at his sides, completely relaxed. His gaze sharpened. His eyes cut through Walker's mask of authority like glass through paper. There was no fear in his expression. Without breaking eye contact, Miller reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. He held the paper out between two fingers and extended it toward Walker. "Actually, we do." Miller's voice was cold and steady. He spoke with the calm, measured cadence of someone who had done this before. Someone who knew how this was going to end. Walker's eyes flicked toward the paper without taking it. His jaw worked beneath his skin as tension tightened along the line of his shoulders. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Miller's hand remained steady. His expression didn't shift. "An ongoing investigation into civil rights violations," Miller said, his tone flat, clinical. He tilted his head slightly. "Your name's at the top of the list." Walker's nostrils flared. His gaze snapped back toward Miller's face. His breath hitched. His hand hovered near his holster. His pulse thundered beneath his skin. His face darkened, his mouth pressing into a thin line. His shoulders squared as he straightened, his body rigid beneath the weight of the accusation. "You can't prove anything," Walker spat through clenched teeth. Miller's eyes glinted beneath the afternoon light. The sharp edges of his cheekbones caught the sun as his mouth curled into a thin, predatory smile. "Oh, we already have." Walker's hand twitched toward his gun. His fingers brushed the worn leather of the holster. "You really want to make this worse?" Agent Quinn's voice sliced through the tension like a whip. Walker's gaze shifted toward her. She stood 3 steps to the side, her hands loose at her sides. Her posture was relaxed, but her stance was wide, balanced. Her head tilted slightly, her gray eyes locked on Walker's hand. Her fingers hovered just above the butt of the gun holstered at her hip. Her expression was a study in precision. Calm, controlled. No visible tension in her body. But her eyes were hard, watchful, waiting. Walker's breath hitched. His hand flexed over the holster. Quinn's gaze sharpened. Her eyes darkened. Her head tilted slightly. And Walker knew. He was a half-second away from creating a situation he couldn't walk away from. His hand stilled. His breath hissed between his teeth. The muscles along his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. His hand fell away from the holster. Walker's eyes darted toward the growing crowd. The park was no longer quiet. There were at least 20 people gathered now. Phones were out, cameras raised, faces tight with disbelief and outrage. Some people whispered. Others stood in stunned silence. But they were all watching, recording. capturing every second of this. And standing in the front row was the woman with the phone. The same woman who had shouted when Walker first grabbed Malik. Her eyes were hard and focused behind the black frame of her sunglasses. She didn't blink. Her hand was steady as the phone lens zeroed in on Walker's face. Malik stood nearby, his chest still heaving from the effort of trying to breathe beneath Walker's weight. His wrists were red and raw where the cuffs had been. His eyes were wide, dark, searching. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his shoulders still trembling beneath the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Miller's gaze didn't shift. He remained a stone wall between Walker and Malik. His shoulders were relaxed, his expression calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. Walker's chest rose and fell rapidly. Sweat gathered at his temples beneath the brim of his hat. His lips curled back over his teeth as his breath hissed through his nose. His hands twitched at his sides. Walker's gaze cut toward the crowd. The phones, the faces, the weight of all those eyes. The woman's phone tilted slightly, capturing every nuance of his expression. Walker's head snapped toward Malik. His eyes burned with something dark and venomous. His lips curled. Walker took a step back. "This isn't over," Walker muttered, his voice low and sharp with barely contained rage. His eyes cut toward Malik, then toward Miller. Miller's expression remained impassive. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked on Walker's face. Walker's chest rose and fell in quick bursts. His fists curled at his sides. He took another step back, and another. Then he turned on his heel and stalked toward his patrol car. His boots hit the pavement hard. His hands were shaking at his sides as he walked. His back was stiff, his shoulders tense beneath the press of his uniform. Walker yanked open the driver's side door of the patrol car and threw himself inside. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breath was ragged and uneven. For a moment he sat there, his breath loud and harsh beneath the hum of the car's engine. His eyes were dark beneath the brim of his hat. Miller's gaze followed him the entire way. He didn't move. Quinn didn't move. Malik's breath hitched as he stood frozen, feeling the weight of his own heartbeat thudding violently beneath his skin. Walker's patrol car sat idling for 3 long, brutal seconds. Then the engine growled as the tires jerked over the pavement. The car rolled away from the curb, the sound of the engine fading as it disappeared around the corner. Miller's gaze remained fixed on the empty street long after the car disappeared from view. His eyes were cold beneath the sharp cut of his brow. His jaw was tight, his mouth a thin, hard line. Quinn's eyes narrowed. She relaxed her stance slightly but didn't take her hand off the holster. Malik's breath came out in a sharp burst. His chest was still tight. His wrists throbbed where the cuffs had been. His hands were trembling at his sides. Miller turned toward Malik. His gaze softened slightly. "It's over," Miller said. His voice was low and calm, steady. Malik's throat tightened. His eyes dropped toward the ground for a second. His breath shuddered out of him. He didn't believe it was over. Not yet. Malik sat in the back of the black SUV, his body pressed into the cool leather of the seat. His hands were still shaking, his wrists red and raw where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. His arms hung limply at his sides, and his chest rose and fell with uneven, shallow breaths. The inside of the SUV was dimly lit, the tinted windows casting a gray shadow over the interior. Outside, the sun was still shining, but Malik felt cold. His skin prickled with the ghost of Walker's grip on his arm. His shoulders ached from being twisted behind his back. Miller sat across from him, his expression calm but sharp. His suit was pressed, his tie perfectly aligned. His hands rested on his knees, fingers steepled. His eyes, dark and focused, were locked on Malik's face. Not hard, not invasive, just steady, controlled. Malik's breath hitched. His chest was still tight from the pressure of Walker's knee in his back. His throat burned from yelling. He could still feel the weight of the cuffs digging into his wrists, the cold metal bruising his skin. He rubbed his wrists absently, trying to chase away the lingering sensation of restraint. His fingers trembled as he traced the reddened grooves left behind by the cuffs. Miller's gaze followed the movement of Malik's hands. His eyes darkened slightly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're okay now," Miller said gently. His voice was low, steady, grounding. Malik's hands stilled. His eyes lifted toward Miller's face, his chest still rising and falling in uneven bursts. He blinked. His throat tightened. "Why did he go after me?" Malik's voice was soft, raw. His mouth tasted like copper. His pulse thudded unevenly in his ears. He knew the answer, but part of him didn't want to hear it out loud. Miller's eyes sharpened. A thin line appeared between his brows. He exhaled slowly, the breath barely audible over the low hum of the car's engine. "Because you're young," Miller said, his voice even and controlled. He didn't blink. "And black." Malik's chest squeezed painfully. His fingers curled over his knees, his nails digging into the fabric of his jeans. His jaw tightened. He looked away, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the park was shrinking in the distance. Kids playing on the playground, people walking dogs, parents pushing strollers. Normal life. Moving on like nothing had happened. But it had. Miller's eyes stayed on Malik's face. His gaze was sharp but steady, calculating, not cold, just careful, controlled. "And because some cops think they can get away with it," Miller added. His tone darkened slightly, a thin undercurrent of steel threading through the softness of his voice. Malik's eyes narrowed. His lips parted as his breath hitched. He sat forward slightly, his hands curling into fists on his thighs. His heart hammered painfully in his chest. "Is he going to get away with it?" Malik's voice cracked. His eyes burned as he searched Miller's face for an answer. A real answer. His shoulders tensed beneath the weight of the question. His pulse hammered violently beneath his skin. Miller's face hardened. His gaze sharpened into something colder, something lethal. His jaw tightened beneath the cut of his cheekbones. "No." Miller's tone was low, sharp, absolute. Malik's breath stalled. His shoulders sagged beneath the sudden drop of tension in his chest. His fingers uncurled from his knees, but his pulse was still racing. Miller's eyes darkened. His expression was calm, almost too calm. His gaze sharpened beneath the thin cut of his brow. His mouth was set in a hard line. "He's already under investigation," Miller said. His tone was clinical now, professional, but there was something cold threading through the edges of his words. "Excessive force, civil rights violations, misconduct." Malik's chest tightened. His mind flashed back to the sound of Walker's knee hitting the pavement, to the brutal press of his body against the bench, to the weight of Walker's hand digging into his arm, to the cold snap of the cuffs against his skin. His heart rate spiked. Miller's eyes remained steady. His hands hadn't moved from his knees. His expression didn't waver. "We've been watching him for a while," Miller said. "Today just confirmed what we already knew." Malik's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His fingers twitched against his knees. Miller's gaze didn't soften. "He's done." Malik's breath hitched. His head dropped toward his chest, his hands curling again over his knees. He squeezed his eyes shut. His throat ached from the effort of holding it together. His chest was still tight. His shoulders trembled beneath the weight of his own breath. Miller's voice softened slightly. "He's not going to get away with it." Malik's breath shuddered out of him. His eyes opened slowly. His gaze lifted toward Miller's face. He didn't speak. He couldn't trust his voice yet. But his hands loosened on his knees. His body relaxed, just slightly, beneath the steady hum of the SUV's engine. Outside the window, the park had disappeared behind them. They were on the road now, moving away from the scene of the incident. The sun cut through the tinted glass in thin beams of gold, casting fractured shadows across Malik's face. He felt the warmth of it on his skin, but he still felt cold beneath it. Miller leaned back slightly. His gaze remained on Malik's face. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. Malik rubbed his wrists again. His fingers trembled over the raw, reddened marks left by the cuffs. The skin there was irritated and bruised. His hands shook slightly as he curled his fingers into his palms. Miller's gaze flicked toward Malik's wrists. His jaw tightened slightly beneath the surface of his calm expression. Malik noticed. His breath hitched. Miller's eyes narrowed. "You're going to be okay." Malik's lips parted, but the words caught in his throat. His chest was still tight. His fingers twitched against his knees. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Miller's gaze stayed on him. His expression was calm but hard-edged, focused. There was no uncertainty in his posture, no hesitation in the steady strength of his tone. Malik's heart rate slowed. Just a little. His breathing evened out beneath the low hum of the engine. Miller's hand rested lightly on his knee for half a second, brief but steady. Then he pulled back. Malik's shoulders sank slightly beneath the absence of pressure. He rubbed his hands over his jeans. His breath steadied. His pulse slowed beneath the surface of his skin. Miller leaned back against the seat. His eyes remained fixed on Malik's face. His expression softened just slightly, but the steel beneath his gaze didn't fade. Malik's eyes drifted toward the window again. The city passed by in flashes of gray and green. His wrists still throbbed. His chest still ached from the lingering weight of Walker's knee. But the tension beneath his skin had begun to unravel. It wasn't gone, but it was better. Miller's gaze remained steady. "He's not getting away with it." Malik's breath shuddered. His chest rose and fell in slow, even bursts. His hands finally stopped shaking. And for the first time in a long time, Malik believed it. Later that evening, the soft glow of the television flickered across the walls of the small living room. The sound of the news anchor's voice filled the space, low and measured but heavy with implication. Malik sat on the couch, his back pressed against the worn cushions. His knees were pulled up slightly, his arms resting over them. His hands were still, but his fingers twitched occasionally, as if his body hadn't quite shaken off the tension from earlier. His eyes were locked on the screen. The television showed grainy footage from a cell phone, shaky but unmistakable. Walker's face filled the frame, twisted with rage, his knee pressed into Malik's back. The sound of Malik's strained, panicked voice echoed faintly through the small speakers. "I'm not resisting. Stop resisting." Malik's breath hitched at the sound of his own voice. The thin, jagged edge of fear in his tone made his chest tighten all over again. His fingers curled slightly over his knees as the video shifted to a new angle. The moment when Walker yanked him toward the patrol car, the sound of the crowd's shouts grew louder. The camera zoomed in on the flash of panic in Malik's eyes. The tightness in his chest deepened. And then the anchor's voice returned, calm and professional. "An FBI investigation has confirmed that Officer Todd Walker is facing multiple allegations of racial profiling and use of excessive force." The screen cut to Walker's mugshot, a sterile, washed-out photo under harsh lighting. His face was hard, set in stone, but his eyes were wide. There was a flicker of uncertainty beneath the surface, the first crack in the foundation. Malik's gaze sharpened. Sources confirm that Walker has been suspended without pay pending further investigation. Malik's chest rose and fell steadily, but his pulse was erratic beneath his skin. His eyes stayed on Walker's face as the broadcast switched to another clip. Walker being escorted out of the police station in handcuffs. His head was down, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out along his neck. His hands were cuffed behind his back, the same way Malik's had been. A thin, sharp sensation unfurled in Malik's chest. Something cold and bitter at the edges. He wasn't sure if it was satisfaction or something darker. The video shifted back to the anchor, a polished woman in a gray suit sitting behind a glass desk. Her expression was carefully neutral, but the weight of the story hung beneath her tone. This incident has raised ongoing questions about racial bias within the department. Malik's hands curled tighter over his knees. His shoulders tensed beneath the thin fabric of his hoodie. His breath hitched as the footage of Walker's face returned to the screen. The sharp cut of his jaw, the flare of his nostrils, the narrowed slits of his pale blue eyes. Even through the screen, Walker's expression held the same dark, simmering anger, the same hatred. Malik's throat tightened. His mind flashed back. The hard bite of the cuffs digging into his wrists, the rough bark of Walker's voice, the weight of his knee driving into Malik's back, the helplessness of not being able to breathe. His breath caught in his throat, his chest seized. A hand touched his arm. Malik's head jerked up sharply. His mother was standing beside him, her dark eyes soft but steady beneath the glow of the television. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder. He hadn't heard her come in. He'd been too focused on the television, on the image of Walker's face, to notice anything else. Malik's breath shuddered. His throat was thick. He swallowed hard, his eyes still burning from the effort of holding it together. His mother sat down beside him, her hand sliding from his shoulder to his hand. She wrapped her fingers around his palm, holding him steady. Malik's breath slowed, just a little. His hand stopped trembling beneath the warmth of her touch. His gaze remained fixed on the screen. Walker's face disappeared as the news cut to a press conference. Miller standing at a podium, his suit crisp and his expression controlled. This department will continue to pursue justice and accountability, Miller was saying, his voice steady and sharp beneath the flashes of camera bulbs. No one is above the law. Malik's chest hitched. His mother's hand squeezed his. That's because of you, she said softly. Malik's eyes widened slightly. His head turned toward her. She was watching him with quiet warmth, her dark brown eyes soft but serious beneath the faint lines at the corners. Her expression was steady, honest. Malik's throat tightened painfully. His jaw tensed beneath the weight of her gaze. I didn't. His voice broke slightly. He shook his head. His gaze dropped toward the floor. I didn't do anything. His mother's grip on his hand tightened. Exactly. Her voice was soft but firm. And that's why it matters. Malik's mouth opened, but no words came out. His chest ached beneath the weight of her words, beneath the quiet strength in her voice. The news cut back to the anchor. The headline beneath the screen read, Officer Todd Walker under investigation, facing possible criminal charges. Malik's gaze lingered on the text. His lips parted slightly. His breath hitched. His heart thudded hard beneath his chest. His mother's hand slid up toward his shoulder. She leaned in and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him toward her. Malik's body stiffened for half a second, and then he sank into her warmth. His head rested lightly against her shoulder. Her hand brushed the back of his head. His breath steadied beneath the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. His fingers loosened against his knees. I'm proud of you, she whispered. Her voice was soft but certain. There was no hesitation in her tone. Malik's breath hitched. His throat burned. He squeezed his eyes shut as his arms wrapped around her, holding on to the warmth of her embrace. His chest trembled beneath the weight of it all, beneath the exhaustion, the relief, the quiet hum of adrenaline still fading beneath his skin. He opened his eyes slowly. The screen still showed Walker's face, but now it was smaller, overshadowed by the bold red text at the bottom of the screen. Suspended without pay. Pending investigation. Malik's gaze darkened slightly. His breath steadied beneath the steady warmth of his mother's arms. For the first time since it happened, since Walker's hands grabbed his arms and shoved him toward the patrol car, Malik felt like he could breathe. He wasn't okay, not yet, but this was a start. Walker sat alone in his apartment, the room dimly lit by the cold, flickering glow of the television. The harsh blue light bathed the worn furniture and cluttered floor in sharp shadows, distorting the edges of the small, stale room. His jaw was tight, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts beneath the wrinkled gray t-shirt clinging to his body. His right hand gripped an empty whiskey glass, the veins in his forearm bulging beneath the thin, pale skin. His left hand was curled into a fist, knuckles white and pressed against his knee. On the screen, His own face stared back at him, frozen mid-motion, his hand twisted in the fabric of Malik's hoodie, his mouth open in a brutal shout. The headline beneath the image burned in glaring white text. Officer Todd Walker under investigation for racial profiling and excessive force. The words pulsed beneath the low drone of the anchor's voice, but Walker wasn't listening anymore. His breath was ragged. His chest tightened beneath the weight of the tension coiled inside him. His eyes, bloodshot and rimmed with dark circles, narrowed beneath the jagged furrow of his brow. His gaze flicked toward the ticker at the bottom of the screen. Suspended without pay pending further investigation. The glass in his hand trembled. His grip tightened, the thin rim of the glass digging into his palm. His lips curled back over his teeth in a silent snarl. His jaw flexed so hard it looked painful. "They think they can take me down." His voice was low, sharp-edged and laced with venom. His hand twitched. The glass flew from his fingers before he even realized he'd released it. It hit the far wall with a violent crack, glass exploding outward in a spray of jagged shards. Tiny pieces of it skittered across the floor, glinting like ice beneath the pale blue light of the television. The sound rang through the room, cutting through the low hum of the news broadcast. Walker's chest heaved. His nostrils flared. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. His shoulders trembled beneath the tension gripping his body like a vice. His eyes snapped back toward the screen. His own face was still there, frozen, twisted with rage, but now the image had shifted to a new clip. Miller standing at a podium, his suit crisp, his expression calm and cold. The flash of camera bulbs illuminated his sharp features as he spoke into the microphone. "This department will continue to pursue justice and accountability. No one is above the law." Walker's face twisted. His breath hissed between his teeth as his fists tightened. "No one is above the law." Walker's lips curled. His breath quickened. "Bullshit." The muscles in his neck strained beneath the rise and fall of his breath. His gaze cut toward the bottle of whiskey sitting on the edge of the coffee table. Half empty. His hand shot out, fingers curling tightly around the glass neck. He twisted off the cap and drank straight from the bottle, the burn of alcohol searing down his throat. His eyes never left the screen. Miller's face disappeared, replaced by footage of Walker being escorted out of the station in handcuffs. Walker's hand froze midair. His breath stilled. His fingers clenched around the bottle hard enough that the glass creaked beneath the pressure. His eyes narrowed, burning beneath the harsh glare of the television light. On the screen, he was stone-faced, his jaw set, his expression hard. But beneath it, beneath the surface, his eyes were wide, his pupils blown with adrenaline. The bottle in Walker's hand dropped onto the coffee table with a heavy thud. "They're making me look weak." His breath hitched. His pulse hammered violently beneath his skin. He wiped the back of his hand over his mouth, dragging it across the stubble lining his jaw. His hand trembled slightly. His gaze sharpened. "That kid." His mouth twisted. His eyes darkened. His breath quickened beneath the rising heat in his chest. His body leaned forward, his elbows digging into his knees. "This is because of that kid." His mind flashed back. Malik's face beneath him, the sharp panic in his eyes, the trembling in his breath. The sound of his voice, strained and ragged beneath the weight of Walker's knee. The crowd's shouts, the phones raised, the accusing stares, and then Miller, standing there with that cold, polished arrogance. Quinn's hand hovering near her holster. The tension in the air so sharp it could have drawn blood, and Malik, standing behind them, breathless, bruised but standing. Walker's mouth twisted into a grimace. His fists tightened. His breath burned in his throat. "They're making me look weak." His eyes darted toward the broken glass on the floor. Shards glittered beneath the television light. His breath hissed through his teeth. His knuckles whitened as his fists curled harder. On the screen, Miller's face returned, calm, cold, the sharp cut of his jaw hard beneath the flash of camera bulbs. No one is above the law. Walker's hand shot toward the remote. His fingers wrapped around it with bruising force. The plastic cracked beneath his grip. He hit the button. The television screen went black. The room sank into heavy silence. The only sound was Walker's ragged breath filling the dark. His hand dropped to his side. His eyes burned beneath the shadows crowding the room. His jaw flexed. His gaze drifted toward the window. The thin curtain was drawn, but through the edges he could see the flicker of streetlights against the night sky. A low hum of traffic echoed through the glass. Walker's mouth curled into a thin, humorless smile. His head tipped back slightly, his eyes narrowing. They think they can take me down? His breath shuddered out of him. His smile sharpened into something dark and thin. No one takes me down. His hand slid toward the bottle on the table, his fingers wrapped around the neck. He raised it to his mouth, his eyes still fixed toward the window. He drank. The burn traced a path down his throat. His hand lowered. His gaze darkened beneath the low shadows cutting across the room. His eyes were sharp beneath the thin blue haze of moonlight filtering through the curtain. The broken glass on the floor caught the dim light, scattering fractured beams across the carpet. His gaze tracked the sharp edges of the glass, jagged, waiting. His chest rose and fell in measured bursts. His mouth twisted into a hard line. His gaze sharpened. They don't know who they're dealing with. He stood. His hand slid over the edge of the table, the tips of his fingers brushing the broken glass. A thin line of blood beaded across his fingertip as the sharp edge bit into his skin. He didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady beneath the cut of his brow. He smiled faintly. No one takes me down. His hand curled into a fist. Blood pooled across his knuckles. Walker stepped toward the window. His gaze cut toward the dark skyline beyond the glass. His breath slowed beneath the steady pulse of adrenaline in his veins. They don't know who they're dealing with. The next morning, the air outside the station was crisp and cold, the weak morning sun barely cutting through the gray, overcast sky. The station's glass doors reflected the empty street behind Walker as he pushed through them. His boots struck the tiled floor with hard, deliberate thuds, the sound echoing through the wide lobby. His uniform was perfectly pressed, the badge on his chest polished to a gleam. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold and flat beneath the brim of his hat. His face was pale, the sharp cut of his cheekbones standing out beneath the tension coiled beneath his skin. He walked with the same confidence he always did, shoulders squared, gaze straight ahead. Other officers in the room lifted their heads as he passed. A few exchanged glances, others quickly turned away. The tension in the air was palpable, hanging thick and unmoving beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Walker's eyes narrowed. His gaze swept the room. He could feel it. The weight of the stairs, the whispered conversations behind closed doors. His chest tightened. His hand curled into a loose fist at his side. They were watching him, waiting. He pushed his shoulders back, his jaw tightening beneath the pressure of their eyes. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Walker crossed the lobby, heading toward the hallway leading to the squad room. His hand brushed over the cool metal of his badge, the familiar weight grounding him. His gaze remained fixed forward, his face hard and unreadable. And then he saw them. Two men in dark suits stood at the end of the hallway. Their postures were rigid, precise. One of them, a tall, clean-cut black man with sharp eyes and a crisp gray suit, stepped forward. Agent David Miller. Miller's face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, cold and controlled beneath the thin cut of his brow. His hands were clasped in front of him, the edges of his jacket falling in a clean line over his chest. His mouth was set in a thin, hard line. Beside him, Agent Sarah Quinn stood with her hands resting at her sides. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail. Her gray suit was sharp, fitted perfectly to her frame. Her expression was flat, her gaze hard. Her eyes were locked on Walker's face. Her hand hovered near the holster on her hip. Walker's stride slowed. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. His mouth pressed into a thin line as his gaze flicked between them. His chest rose and fell beneath the sharp line of his uniform. His jaw flexed beneath the thin pull of his skin. Miller's eyes darkened. He stepped forward. "Officer Walker," Miller said, his voice low and even. He held up a black leather badge holder. The gold flash of the FBI crest glinted beneath the fluorescent lights. Walker's steps halted. His back straightened. His breath slowed. His hand twitched toward his belt. Miller's gaze sharpened. "You're under arrest," Miller said. His tone didn't shift. "For obstruction of justice and violation of civil rights." Walker's eyes widened. "What?" Quinn moved before Walker could finish the thought. Her hand shot toward his wrist, her grip hard and bruising. She spun him with brutal precision, twisting his arm behind his back with professional efficiency. The cold snap of metal filled the hallway as the cuffs clicked over Walker's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," Quinn said, her tone clinical, sharp. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Walker's breath hitched. His muscles tensed beneath the sharp pull of Quinn's grip. His head whipped toward Miller, his mouth twisting into a snarl. "You can't do this!" Walker's voice cracked beneath the strain of his rising anger. His breath came faster now, sharp bursts cutting through the tension hanging in the air. Miller's gaze didn't shift. His face remained perfectly still, calm beneath the hard cut of his jaw. "See you in court," Miller said, his tone cold. Quinn's hand tightened around Walker's arm. She pushed him forward, her grip steady and controlled. Walker stumbled slightly beneath the sudden pull of her hand. His boots scuffed against the tile. Walker's eyes burned beneath the fluorescent light. His jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth ache. His breath was shallow, fast. His pulse hammered beneath his skin. His head whipped toward Miller. "This is bullshit," he growled. "I'm a cop." Miller's gaze didn't waver. "Not anymore." Walker's chest heaved beneath the weight of the words. His hands curled into fists behind his back, his wrists straining beneath the cuffs. His eyes burned as Quinn shoved him toward the exit. Officers in the room were staring now, wide-eyed, stunned. A few of them whispered to each other. A young officer near the front desk shifted uneasily, his eyes darting toward Walker before quickly looking away. Walker's gaze snapped toward them, his face twisted in rage. "What the hell are you looking at?" No one answered. No one moved. Quinn's grip on his arm tightened. She shoved him toward the glass doors at the front of the station. Walker stumbled beneath the force of the push. His shoulder hit the doorframe. "Keep moving," Quinn said sharply. Walker's eyes burned. His breath came fast and shallow beneath the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. He could feel the heat of the stairs cutting into his back as the officers behind him watched, silent and unmoving. His gaze cut toward Miller. Miller was still standing at the edge of the hallway, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His expression was calm, controlled, his eyes dark beneath the harsh glare of the lights overhead. Walker's breath hitched. His pulse hammered beneath his skin, his hands curled into fists behind his back. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles along his neck strained. The glass doors swung open as Quinn forced him outside. The cold bite of the morning air struck Walker's skin like a slap. His breath fogged in the air as he stumbled down the concrete steps. The black SUV was parked at the curb. The rear door was already open. Walker's eyes narrowed. His shoulders tensed. His breath hitched. "You can't do this," he growled, his voice low and venomous. Miller's face didn't change. His eyes glinted beneath the pale gray sky. "We already did." Quinn pushed Walker toward the open door. Walker's feet skidded over the pavement as his body twisted toward the car. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth creaked. His breath shot from his chest in sharp, angry bursts. Quinn shoved him into the back seat. The door slammed shut behind him with a sharp, metallic thud. Walker's breath hitched. His wrists strained against the cuffs. His shoulders heaved. His pulse hammered violently beneath his skin. Through the darkened window, Walker's gaze locked on Miller. Miller stood at the top of the steps, his gaze hard and unwavering. Quinn walked back toward the SUV and slid into the front seat. The engine growled to life beneath the weight of the tension lingering in the air. Walker's breath hissed through his teeth. His eyes burned with cold, seething rage as Miller's figure disappeared behind the tinted glass. The SUV pulled away from the curb. The station faded in the rear window. Walker's breath slowed. His mouth curled into a thin, hard line. His eyes narrowed beneath the sharp shadows cutting across the inside of the vehicle. His jaw tightened. His wrists flexed beneath the cold bite of the cuffs. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. And then, Walker smiled. Thin, cold, deadly. "This isn't over." In court, Malik testified with quiet strength. The video was played for the jury. Gasps filled the room. Walker sat at the defense table, his face stone cold. The jury delivered the verdict. Guilty. Walker's face twisted in rage as he was led away in cuffs. Part 10. The Closure. Malik sat in the park a week later. Miller approached him. "You did good," Miller said. Malik smiled faintly. "Thanks for having my back." "Always." As Miller walked away, Malik closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Justice had finally been served.